Hello and welcome everyone to the How To series of our online tutorials available at lineconsulting.com. And this series is a series on evaluation. Before we begin, just a quick introduction. My name is Melvin Tan, and I am the principal and founder of Line Consulting. Um, I've been advising schools for the last 10 years, since 2004, in the areas of staff management, strategic planning, and systems and processes. And line consulting is essentially known in the schools in Singapore for our work with them in those areas. Particularly in the last few years, we have developed quite a fair bit of expertise in terms of processes. And so today we would like to take you through the first of the four-part practical guide that we would like to share with you in terms of evaluation. Now, before we get to that, a quick question. What is evaluation? Let's face it, sometimes we throw around some of these keywords as well as technical terms or what we call jargons without kind of fully realizing or fully understanding what it means. And so today we would like to take you through that process itself of understanding what is evaluation. Now, before we start, a little bit of a background. It all started with this guy. Yeah, this guy, his name is W. Edwards Deming. And Edwards Deming has a saying. He says that if you can't describe what you're doing as a process, you really do not know what you're doing. Yeah, so Deming is essentially saying that whatever you do in terms of an organization, every function, every practice, every action that you take in the organization can be described in the form of a process. Because once you are able to describe it in the form of a process, you would then be able to do it consistently. You are able to replicate it over and over again, and you are able to measure each and every part of it, as well as to be able to look at improvement. So it all started with this cycle called the PDCA cycle. As many of you are familiar, it's plan, do, check, and act. So the cycle goes like this, where you have something. To begin with, when you have something, you always start off with the planning. And that planning could be in the form of brainstorming, doing some form of a customer analysis, for example. So the planning stage will lead you to decide what you want to do. So this do part could be a series of action, and after you have look at the series of action, and then you would check against some of your key performance indicators, for example, to see if it's aligned to the program objectives as well as the organizational objectives, and then finally you act. Yeah, so the PDCA cycle is something that we're all very familiar with. However, there is one small little limitation, and this limitation is essentially targeted at the fact that the PDCA cycle is a linear model. In other words, as you can see in the direction of the arrow there, this whole process will go round and round and round. And with each round of this iteration, you come up with new improvement. Nothing wrong with that, except that these improvements will at best be what they call incremental improvements. So you probably need to go through this cycle many, 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 many different times, or through many iterations before you can seek a breakthrough. So there has to be a better way to re-look at this whole process itself. And so that's where it leads us to this next model that we have here. This is called the single loop and the double loop learning. So the story goes like this. We start off with certain assumptions about what we want. Yeah, and based on those assumptions, we carry out a series of strategies and techniques. And finally, it leads us to the results. And at the end of the results, we kind of look back to see whether we have achieved the targets that we have set out to achieve. And if we have, we continue doing what we're doing. But if not, then that's where we go back and change our strategies. So, so this is the process that we talked about in terms of the PDCA cycle. Now, the only issue here is that if you go through this single loop, at best you would see is what we call an incremental improvement. Once you want to see a quantum leap, that's where you have to go through that process of looking at assumptions, right? Revisiting the assumptions oftentimes require us to relook at the paradigm that we see things through, and with that, it brings about a better way of doing things. So, take an example. In the past, when I was in school, the assumption of my teacher was that if I am seated down and I'm quiet and I have my books and I'm looking at my teacher, it means that I'm learning. And so with that kind of assumption, teachers naturally take on more didactic kind of teaching practices. And with that, at the end of the day, they kind of see whether the results did the results meet their expectations. If not, they go back and redo some of the strategies that they have carried out, i.e., they may do more teaching and they may do more drill and practice. But essentially, these days, the assumption about how learning takes place has been fundamentally shifted. We understand that children no longer learn in a way that they are being restricted. Sometimes it's best if they are learning in teams and when they learn best in social settings. So with that assumption, of course, the kind of strategies that teachers would use would not just be the chalk and talk method. Yeah, it would involve other kind of strategies as well, like collaborative learning, use of ICT tools, for example, and all that the series of strategies and techniques that would lead us to the final results. So the key learning here at the end of the day is that if you want to make a incremental improvement, you change the strategies, you change the techniques. If you want to make a quantum leap, that's when you relook and you change the assumption. Well, that's paraphrasing from Stephen Covey, where he says that if you want to make incremental improvement, you change behavior. If you want to make a quantum leap, you change your paradigm. Yeah, so this is the model that we have. Now let's look at it in terms of a process flow. As I mentioned, learning consulting, one of the key expertise we have is in terms of processes. And so here we want to start off with the end in mind. Again, giving credit, or many a times is credited to Stephen Covey, but it actually comes from Aristotle. So it says that you start off with the end in mind, you look at the results that you want. And with the results, you then decide what is the planned approach. And here is where we have the series of assumptions and hypotheses about how things work. Yeah. And of course, once you have the planned approach, you then decide what is the actions that you want to deploy. And once you've deployed those actions, at some point in time, you need to evaluate. Now, what do you evaluate? At one end, you look back to this part here where you want to evaluate. In other words, you want to assess whether the results that you get is expected. So you want to evaluate against the targeted results that you have planned in the first place. Now, when that doesn't work, then it's time for you to go back and relook at the deployment. And at the deployment, this is where we want to evaluate the processes or the practices or the programs that you have. Yeah, because these are the set of processes that you kind of deploy to get you the results. And so you need to go through this single loop learning X number of times. And once you've done that, at some point in time, you want to go back and ask yourself, is our plan approach sound to begin with? So this is where you really go back and relook at assumptions. And with those assumptions that you have, you ask yourself, are those assumptions still valid? So recall back to the example that I gave you earlier on about how my teacher would have assumed how we learn best. That is where we say that, you need to go back and relook at assumption. Now, next is where we look at finally, let's take a look at this slide here, which is the clear definition of evaluation. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is to kind of give you a bit of a background as to kind of preface this whole 4-part practical guide that we're talking about. So as we come to this part here, we want to dive deep into what evaluation is. Now, according to EFQM, or European Foundation for Quality Management, Evaluation is defined as this. It's essentially looking at the assessment and refinement of the deployed approaches through a series of activities, that is to monitor the implementation, as well at the end of it to analyze the results that have been achieved. And one more thing that is very often forgotten is that you also want to look at what are some learning activities. What do they mean by that? Essentially is to say that through this whole process of analysis and monitoring, you will then be able to gain some learning. And with that learning, you will be able to do two things. One is if it has been meeting the targets, yeah, consistently meeting the targets, then you know that you have a best practice in place. Now, if it consistently doesn't meet the target, then it means that there is a gap, and the gap will call for a series of improvement opportunities. And that's essentially what we want to talk about in the next practical guide, where we walk you through what do you need to look out for when conducting an evaluation. Now, before we go, just a note here, in case you're getting this independently outside of our membership site, do head on down to our website at lineconsulting.com. That is lineconsulting, one word.com. Yeah, and sign up at no charge to get all these guides as well as more of the series to come. Plus, we'll be conducting webinars from time to time, as well as you get the ability to ask a question pertaining to your organization in terms of processes, in terms of systems, for example, and we'll see how we can answer some of those questions. Yeah. With that, I will see you in the next part here, part 2 of the practical guide. Thank you.